It's indeed my pleasure to start off this series of ecology talks, and especially during the pandemic and when there is a lockdown, there have been a number of requests where the children had to be kept thinking, and these are the kind of school children who are very curious about science. So in that sense, ecology can't be a better area to reach the children of that age. And therefore, I'm very thrilled and happy that this series has begun. And who can be a better person to start off this series than my colleague, Professor Ramakrishnan. She's been in MCBS, where I work, since 2016. And she's currently an associate professor. And she also collaborates with me on some of the projects. Uma is well known in the area and in the country. But just to say a few words, she has got the Parker Gentry Award, and she's also a fellow of the Indian National Science Academy, Delhi. And her work interests are on conservation of tigers, and she has taken to wildlife biology as her specialization. And indeed, she has also initiated, I would say, the entire ecology and wildlife area in MCBS, which has been thriving very nicely. And the following talks are also going to be by some of our colleagues in the area. And apart from conservation of tigers, Uma is interested in biodiversity in general of mammals and even plants, where we work together now. And when we say biodiversity, especially the parts like Western Ghats and the Himalayan region. And I also would like to point out that she's one of the enterprising women scientists, and she is a mother of two lovely daughters. And she has also given a number of talks about her work research interests. In particular, she has given some talks in the series of TED and Inc. However, today she has kindly agreed to share some of her interests with the school children. And I'm very thankful, Uma, and I invite you to give the talk today on pandemics and biodiversity. Uma, please.
Thank you, Saudamini, for that wonderful introduction. Thank you. So, Chandrakant, I'll go ahead and share my screen now.
Yes, please do.
So just before that, thanks all for being here. And I should say, initially itself that this work that I'm going to present, or this talk, is a little bit new for me. It's, I usually, if you have noticed or seen my talks before, I speak about tigers, which is what, as Saudamini said, I work a lot on. So this picture, for example, shows, a cartoon someone drew of me. I never get that close to tigers, I should tell you. I work on their DNA mostly. But recently, I have been working a lot on biodiversity the last 10 or so years, and that understanding has led me to thinking a little bit more about disease. I thought it was very relevant for us to discuss this today. And I'll really like to keep it short so that we can have more time for questions and discussion. And feel free to ask any questions that may be on your mind. You don't have to worry about whether they're good questions or not, because the idea of this forum is really to talk freely and to think freely. That's what science is about as well. So, we all use the word biodiversity very loosely. And I thought I would go on to start by actually defining what is biodiversity, right? So biodiversity is basically the diversity of life on Earth. And this is a picture just showing, several species which live in rainforests, for example. And it's measured in terms of species, okay? So, I know you would have studied this in school. You've studied probably the basics of evolution. And evolution is the science which deals with understanding the generation of biodiversity and the kinds of pressures like selection and so on the environment may exert on species and populations. So, how we measure biodiversity when we talk about it in general, say across the world, we talk about it in terms of the numbers of species. I sometimes use the word species richness, which is just another word for, how rich you are in terms of species. And so we quantify biodiversity, we measure it in terms of the number of species. You might have studied a little bit about how new species evolve, and I'm not going to talk too much about that today. It's some work we've done, for example, in the Western Ghats, as Saudani was saying. But new species tend to evolve when there is some distance between, say, two populations. That's called allopatry. They're separated in space or time, maybe, and that's how new species tend to evolve. And what's really interesting about biodiversity is that it's not uniformly distributed across the world. So I think this is very important for us to realize that in the global south, we are really rich in biodiversity. So, something I always feel very strongly, even with my children, is a lot of the media and the content we tend to watch is Western. And so we are kind of bombarded with a lot of, Western media. And so we may not really know about those very special and beautiful things also in other parts of the world. And this is a picture of vascular plants. They are, in terms of numbers, we have lots of plants. They compared to mammals or birds, number of plants is way higher. And if you see here, you can actually see, I guess I can just point to it, but you can see, for example, that the tropics or tropical areas tend to have many plant species. Another thing you'll notice is that islands have lots of species. And if you really look a bit more closely, so you can see the darker colors represent higher biodiversity or more species, that mountain ranges also tend to have lots of species, right? If you look at this also in terms of vertebrates, which is basically, reptiles, birds, fish, mammals, again you see that there are some places which have really high biodiversity. In this case, again, red is high biodiversity. You can see the Amazon, for example, has really high biodiversity. Whereas the temperate areas, with the colder areas, tend to have lower biodiversity, right? So it's just important for us to know that, biodiversity is not uniformly distributed, and some places have more biodiversity than do others. And a lot of people spend their time trying to understand why this is the case, and so on. So today I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to go on to tell you a little bit about what's happening with our biodiversity today. Also, before that, actually, of course, animals are beautiful, but does it really matter to have biodiversity? Well, I think we're seeing a lot of that today. Um, Biodiversity is essential for our survival on this planet. So this is just a graphic which talks about ecosystem services. So biodiversity itself provides humans services, right? So for example, especially in India, all the fruit you eat is pollinated by mostly wild insects, right? So without them, you may not have mangoes, you may not have all the fruit you eat, right? Biodiversity also provides us raw materials like wood, or various kinds of building materials. It regulates against natural disasters. You must have seen the cyclone recently, which hit our coasts, in Western India, sorry, Eastern India. And basically, there's a lot of suggestions that the mangroves really buffered the impact of that cyclone. Had the mangroves not been there, the impact of the cyclone would have been much higher. So they regulate these natural disasters, these forests and this biodiversity that we have. Other than that, I mean, water is the most basic thing. Whatever technology we may have, how many ever iPhones or whatever in other technology, we may go to the moon, but we don't know how to make water, right? We still depend on our mountains for water, our rivers. And so, this itself is a very like wake up call that we really depend on our biodiversity. There's also like wastewater management, this biological control. I'm sure you've heard of scavengers. They eat up a lot of carrion like vultures, and that actually reduces the burden of these carrion on the planet. We gain a lot of medical resources from biodiversity. biodiversity, whether you're thinking about Ayurveda or other traditional systems of medicine which have suggested specific plants as having a medicinal value, or even modern medicine where specific chemical compounds are used, but many of them do also come from our knowledge of biodiversity. So apart from this, there's of course carbon. You've all heard about climate change and how the climate itself is changing. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But this is just to remind you that it's not just a lot of times we think that people who speak about the environment are radical, or they're trying to put across a point of their own point of view. But I wanted to really stress to all of you, because especially the future, these are going to be major challenges for all of you, that biodiversity is critical for human well-being. Without biodiversity, it will be impossible to have continued human well-being. Okay, so that said, um, it's been very evident in the last, say, 10 years and 5 years and 2 years that we are really losing biodiversity. Okay, so this is something which, for example, when I started doing my PhD, a long time ago, more than about 25 years ago, I started, and it seemed like, oh, we are fine, species are fine. But today we know that that's not the case. We're losing biodiversity, and there are many reasons for this. What we see as evidence of that is extinction of species. But this loss of biodiversity is driven by many factors, like habitat loss, or what we call land use change. We lose forests, or we lose grasslands, and so on. And there's also things like hunting direct impacts, right? Or poaching, hunting or poaching, invasive species, new species which are coming in from other places and taking over ecosystems, and also, of course, global processes like climate change, right? So we are losing biodiversity, and this is something which is of great concern to us. And just to make it more, they're all very general. So let's make it a little bit more specific. I really love these pictures. They are from a database called Anthrome, which made predictions about forest cover or green cover, let's say, in the Asia, and specifically you can focus on India. So this is, for example, what forest cover probably looked like, or green cover, in 1700, 1800, 1900, and 2000. Okay, so you can see that there's been a huge loss of green cover, right? And associated with this also is a huge increase in human population size, right? Human numbers have been growing tremendously, and that's also part of the reason for this biodiversity loss. So this basically results in fragmentation. No, so what's happening now? For example, if you look at this is some of the other work we do. You look at a map of India. In black here we have what are called the tiger reserves, or areas which have been set aside for tiger conservation. And you can see that you know they are all far apart from each other, right? They are not like very close to each other, and it might be hard for tigers to actually move between these populations, right? These areas, these places where they are allowed to live with protection. They do live elsewhere also. They live outside protected areas as well. So what this means is then there are populations that are isolated, and these isolated populations again have a high chance of extinction, right? So the number of animals or the size of the population also correlates with extinction. So this is all very general about biodiversity, and its loss. But the topic of today's conversation is more about pandemics, right? Before we go to a pandemic, it's a very specific definition. Let's just talk about emerging infectious diseases. So emerging infectious diseases are infections that are either new or were previously known, so they could be re-emerging, but they reappear in a new species, population or area. Okay, so what happens is that we think of our world as mostly humans. If I ask you, who is your family, you will talk to me about your parents and your siblings. You might talk to me about society, about your school, about your interactions. But all of those you'll talk to me about, especially if you live in a city with other humans, right? But in reality, we actually interact with lots of other species as well. So this picture actually shows that there are diseases because of this interaction which have spilled over or gone from wildlife. For example, Ebola virus, Hendra virus, and Nipah virus, and we'll talk a little bit more about these later, to humans, or from livestock, which are basically cows, pigs, chicken, horses, etc. And here again, there's Rift Valley fever, E. coli, cowpox, and so on. And vice versa, from wildlife to livestock, or livestock to wildlife as well. The famous example is canine distemper, and um, I'll talk a little bit about this in the end if I remember. So these are basically emerging infectious diseases because of this. Okay, so maybe I should be a little more clear. So remember, when we saw that picture of India in 1700, there was a lot of green, right? So you can imagine that in the places where there was no green, uh, there were people, say. Okay, so now the you can imagine that the interfaces between people and the green. Imagine the green has the wildlife, the green has the biodiversity. The interaction between the green and the white was very low. So let's just go back to that so that you can see that. But now look at the last figure, which is 2000, and you can immediately see that the abutting, or the interaction between the green and the white is much more, right? The area of interaction is much higher, right? So this itself means that the chances of diseases spilling over when there is fragmentation should be high. That's what you would just infer without any doing any you know anything formal, just like looking at it. That's what you would think, right? That's what you might guess. You've not done any analysis, but that's what you might guess, that there's a lot more interaction. If interaction means there is spillover, then in 2000 versus 1700, you might expect more spillover, right? It's a very simple kind of a deduction. Okay. But then we started by talking about pandemics. Now I want to be careful to distinguish between these things. The other thing is, I want you to be very careful about not making judgments. I'm not saying that emerging infectious diseases are bad. Okay. Uh, I'm just saying that this is what they are. Okay. I'm just stating it. And then they could become pandemics. They could spread across the world. And here are three possible ways in which they do, right? So the first thing is increased travel, right? Now, if you had a spillover or an emerging infectious disease that came from wildlife in an area which was very remote, and there wasn't much of travel from there, nobody else got it, it would just remain there, right? It would not be a pandemic. It might be an outbreak, or, basically a spillover event, but it may not go anywhere, no? On the other hand, another thing which causes a lot of this kind of emergence is animal trade. So you may not know this, but drugs and guns, wildlife trade is the biggest international trade. Internet unstable, it's fine. Yeah. So that's it. And I first was really shocked. I thought that drugs are a huge international trade market, and I would guess that weapons are as well. But actually, weapons are below wildlife trade. So wildlife, or it may not be wildlife alone, but it's like pet animals, aquarium fish, this, that, everything is traded, moved all over the world, right? So this also can lead to things going, long distances, and result in pandemics. versus, a regional outbreak which just dies off. Okay. And the last thing, the last connection, which is really, again, surprising a bit, is climate change. When you say the word climate change, you immediately think, okay, it's going to get hotter. So what? Big deal. But it's also true that this increase in temperature affects a lot of other species. For example, mosquitoes are predicted to go up the mountain because it's now warmer, right? So they can actually live higher up. Temperature is very important for insects. They do well when it gets warmer. You know, that's why there are so many more insects in tropical areas. And for example, if you go to Europe, there are not that many insects as there are, if you're just walking in the evening, you'll encounter so many insects, right? In a place like India. So something like this is also what causes the spread, right? These are the links with, in this case, the travel is a socio-political, how things have changed, how our world has changed. We're very happy it's changed that way. We're much more connected. But on the other hand, that has a negative effect. It also allows the spread of these emerging infectious diseases across continents. And that's exactly what has happened in the case of SARS-CoV-2, which is the virus which causes COVID-19. More and more studies are coming out showing that, like if you look at a country, most of the infections initially came from somewhere else, uh, from air travel, and then it spread. So it's not that, mm, we can talk a little bit more about this later, but the original virus was from a bat and then maybe through some intermediate host. It's not that bats all over the world carried this virus and then transmitted it locally. No, what happened was there was transmission once or a few times maybe, and then it has spread. And the spread has to do with travel, not to do with bats, right? It's to do with human society, how we are living our lives today. Okay. So these are just some points to say that this link between, and here for example, there's animal trade is linked, is a conservation issue. Trading endangered species threatens their survival, right? Why are tigers threatened with extinction today? That's because tiger parts are traded. People want tiger skins. People want tigers for other things, right? So because of this kind of trade, not specifically of tigers, but trade of endangered species like pangolins. Pangolins have been traded extensively, and there is some suggestions of a link for pangolins and SARS-CoV-2 as well. It's not proven yet, but this extensive trade of species is something which can also cause diseases to spread around. Okay. So this is just one figure, and there are many like this, but just to show you that this is not a small number of things we're talking about. 75% of infectious diseases today are thought to be zoonotics. Zoonotics means something which has come from wildlife or animals to us. So this is a huge number, right? It almost felt like, when we got antibiotics, when we were gifted antibiotics, it's not a gift, but when science resulted in the discovery of antibiotics, we thought we're good. Now we're fine. Have nothing to fear of infectious diseases. But that's not true, right? So, for example, you see here, there's antimicrobial resistant strains of bacteria. So basically, the antibiotics, the bacteria are evolving to be able to resist them, right? And there's drug resistant malaria. There's all kinds of infections now all over the world. Not, and here again you can see, you might quickly ask me, why are there so many of these in the West, say in the US? So some of this could just be because this paper is kind of an American centric paper. But basically there are, and there's also less detection of these things in other parts of the world. There aren't that many people looking for them, but basically there are lots of diseases which are emerging. So I just wanted to give this to you as a perspective, that it's not that this is the first time it's happened, there's something very new. No, it's been happening a lot, right? Especially in the last 20 or 30 years. Okay. And a very nice example, again, linking this whole thing back to biodiversity, is the Hendra virus. And Salamini, you mentioned there are some people who may attend from Australia. So, yeah, so basically, this is something which happened in Australia. So, these Australian fruit bats, so I can talk more to you about bats. I really love bats later. But, these bats which eat fruit and they hang upside down from trees, they sleep at night, they're nocturnal, right? Sorry, they feed at night, they fly around and feed at night, they sleep through the day. So these bats, they had lost their natural habitat, and so they started roosting closer and closer to suburban areas which are closer to cities, right, or human habitation. And because of this, they came and were roosting in these types of areas. Roosting means sleeping, that's where they live. And they shed these viruses. Now, nothing happens to the bats, by the way. They don't get sick. And we can talk about that also later in the question answer session. I don't think the answers are well known exactly why they don't fall sick, but they shed these viruses. And horses which were around in that area, these were horse farms, horse what are they called, stables, happened to eat things which fruits which had those viruses or other things. And then these infected horses transmitted the disease to humans. Okay, so here is another very interesting evolutionary thing. Okay, so when a new pathogen comes, as a new species is coming, right, um, to a new host. Now the humans and the horses are new hosts, right? It could be that the new host is not able to react immunologically, not able to respond to the virus or the new pathogen fast enough, and so they may be affected more than the species in which the pathogen has existed for some time. Okay, so this is a case of Hendra virus, and it's a really very nice example where we know there's a direct link between habitat loss and then the bats kind of moving their roosts to areas where there were more humans and higher human presence, and basically transmission of a disease. So, what about EIDs or emerging diseases in India? Now, this is just something we've put together. It's not an exhaustive list at all by any means, but there have been a lot of evidence of disease emergence in India, which is from emergence and re-emergence. You can see, for example, that there are many cases which are, many like scrub typhus has emerged many times and in different places. Nipah has also emerged multiple times. And we'll take a minute now to speak about the Nipah outbreak. Now, I don't know whether all of you are familiar, but there was an outbreak of Nipah virus in 2018 in Kerala. A new disease, right? You don't even know what it is. So you have to first figure out what is it, right? And you do this maybe looking at the symptoms. Maybe you get the genetic material of the pathogen from a person who is infected, and you sequence it or you read it and you compare it with known pathogens. And these are different ways or tools that scientists can use to try to figure out what is this new disease. So when the Nipah outbreak happened, it was actually handled very, very well. So I don't want you to get the impression that we are not in India able to handle these things. It was handled extremely well. There's a lot of research done and a lot of on-ground research to really track what had happened. And in this particular case, it turned out that patient zero, the first patient, may have actually gotten it directly from either a bat or something that the bat had eaten. But Nipah, for example, in Bangladesh, comes from date sap. So that these date palm trees, people put up little cups to collect the sap of the tree, and that is sometimes either fermented or drunk as such. And the bats were also flying through and drinking the sap, and so the saliva of the bats got mixed up into the sap, and people then drank that, and that resulted in the Nipah outbreak there. So Nipah is very different from the current coronavirus. It's a paramyxovirus, and it's basically much more deadly. So 70 to 80% of the people who are infected may die. But it does not spread as much, right? Like coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2, it has much more ability to spread. And that's what some of the things they're seeing today. But many of these are not necessarily via, they could be protists, right? Like viruses. For example, plague, sorry, not plague, brucellosis, scrub typhus, leptospira, all of these are bacterial pathogens, right? And they come repeatedly. So they don't maybe have as much, they don't have such a high, they don't kill people as easily as, say, Nipah or Ebola. Ebola, we have not had in Asia at all, but Ebola, there have been multiple outbreaks in Africa. And it happens again and again, right? It's not just once. So those kinds of things are more deadly, and some things are less deadly but spread more. But there are a lot of diseases which we have been dealing with for a very, for many, many years, right? In India as well, we have seen disease emergence. So then, can we put all these together, these different pieces of the puzzle? We talked about different things, biodiversity, pandemics, and PIDs. And can we ask, what is the connection? So the way the scientists do this is, see, when you have a disease which emerges, you only know it after it's happened, right? So what you can do is you can collect all the information on all the diseases which have emerged. You can look at what was happening in that situation, and you can do an analysis to ask, are there specific things which are common between all the situations where diseases emerged? Can you find things which are very important then? You may then suggest that those particular things are very important for diseases to emerge. So based on those, it's called a meta-analysis, where you compile data from across the world and try to look for common factors which cause disease emergence, suggested that there's a high chance of spillover, which is disease emergence spilling over from wildlife to humans or domesticated livestock to humans and so on. And there is high land use change. So we earlier called this fragmentation, right? But it's not just fragmentation, it is change. Okay? That is, it's not just that we lose forest, but that we lose forest and that lost forest now becomes agriculture. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit about this later. High human population density, of course, when you have many humans who are interacting, the chances is that one or the other, somehow or the other, spillover will happen. And also very important, high mammal biodiversity. So if you have a lot of snakes in a place, it doesn't make it more likely to have spillover there. But if you have a lot of mammals, you have a higher chance of spillover. Now, why is this? Well, see, all mammals are more similar to each other than I am to a snake, right? I'm more similar to a mouse than I am to a snake. That's how evolution works. That is the basis of evolution and the tree of life. And so, my physiological processes, how my body works, how my cells are, is more similar to a mouse than to a snake. And so, when there's a new pathogen, it's more likely to be able to infect me if it came from a mammal, if it was infecting a mammal, than it can infect a snake, because they are quite different. Their cells, their physiology, everything is different. I mean, it's similar, but it is also different. So because of this, it's easier for us to get have spillover happening occurring from mammals. Okay, and so when you put all of these together and then you say, let's predict them, let's make a prediction based on what we know across the world. Where do we expect to have high spillover? This is a map showing that risk, right? The risk or the chance of spillover. And again, the brighter colors means higher chance. And you can see again, very interestingly, that India has a high chance of spillover. Okay, so this is probably because slide you saw earlier, there's been a lot of land use change or not just loss of biodiversity, but change which has happened in India. Okay, so we'll get back to this in a little bit. But since we were talking about mammals, and I have worked on mammals, I was very curious to know, okay, so then where in India do we have high mammal biodiversity? So this is, for example, showing all of Asia. And that's when you can really see that contrast. So remember here, for example, we said that there are three things, right? High human population density, high number of mammals, and high land use change. Now, if you look only at the number of mammals, high number of mammals, again, the reds here are more mammals. You can see that Southeast Asia, right? Basically, Myanmar, etc., etc., right? Not islands of Southeast Asia also, but Myanmar, Cambodia, Vietnam, etc., Thailand have high number of mammals compared to India. Okay, right? India is greener, and this area is redder, more red. But if you look at the risk of spillover, it is higher in India. That is because of the amount of mammals but I'm back. I hope you can see me.
Yes, we can see you.
Yeah. Thanks, Chandra. Yeah. So I guess what I was saying is that within India itself, the northeastern part of India has a high number of mammals, and the Himalayas you can see, but also another place which has a reasonably high number of mammals is the Western Ghats. You can see these boxes in the southern part of India along the coast. That's the Western Ghats. So some of the work we've done, I'm just going to talk about it very briefly, is on mammals in the northeast and in the Western Ghats. Okay, so we worked for several years now on bats in the northeast, and this is a place you can see this place. It's called Mimi. It's a small village on the border of Myanmar in the state of Nagaland, and it's a very beautiful place. You can see it's very undulating. This picture doesn't do justice at all, but it's a lot of mountains, and this is Mimi village
Um,
over here on top. What
Ma,
happened? Hear me?
you'll have to share your screen again. Uh,
Oh, sorry. Okay.
thank you.
Sorry about that. Can you see it now?
Yes, we can see it.
Great, thank you. So yeah, so what I was saying is, I'll just reiterate here that when you look at the number of mammals, again, the highest number of mammals is in the northeast, right? The edge, almost touching Southeast Asia, and basically uh, the Western Ghats in the south. Okay. So this is where we have done some studies, and I'll just spend a few minutes talking to you about them. By no means have we understood everything. We are just starting. So I'm just sharing with you our initial, very preliminary, ideas and experiences here. So this is basically where we have worked in the Northeast. It's a place in the state of Nagaland called Nimi, right next to the border with Myanmar. And you can see it's beautiful with very undulating terrain, mountains. And in this place, Mimi, where we have the Bomar who live, Nagas called the Bomar, there are caves all around at the bottom of these hills, and many of these caves have bats. And for a long time, there's been a cultural tradition to a few days of the year smoke the cave, and basically the bats come out and they are often dead or dying. To harvest these bats, and they are after they are boiled, they are eaten, they're consumed. Okay, and they're also shared as gifts between neighboring villages and so on. This is a cultural tradition. Please do not judge it in any way. We were very interested to see and study this because we thought this is a situation where that interaction we talked about, we talked about interaction is very high. When I talked to you about Nipah, I said, how did it start? Because some individual, some human interacted with bats. Now, here you can see from this picture, there are many, many people who are interacting with bats. And if these bats do carry some virus which could potentially spill over, this is a situation where there's a high chance of disease emergence, right? I'm not trying to alarm you in any way. Please don't get alarmed. This tradition has been going on for many, many years. And I wanted to make that very clear. There is no known outbreak. Nothing has happened. These people are fine. They are healthy, right? So, but it's an interesting situation for a scientist because if you see a very high intensity interaction, and you know that bats, there are fruit bats here who live in this cave, and we know they carry potentially viruses. How come? What's happened? So that's what we were trying to investigate, and our results suggest that there is some sharing of pathogens between the bats that are hunted. That's what we sample, and the people. But we were able to detect this only with antibodies, not with genetic material. We were not able to sequence yet any virus from the bats or the people, showing that there is direct transmission. That's the how we would assess it. No, if we were able to get the bat, so even in the Nipah case, it's still a hypothesis. They were not able to sample or find the bat, or look at the genetic material of the bat, compare it with the genetic material of the pathogen in the human. And if they are exactly the same, you would say, oh, it's come from the bat to the human. So that's not, we were not able to do that. And even here, we were not able to get any genetic material of virus from bats and from humans yet. We're still working on this. And hopefully we may find something. But we were able to get some signatures or some evidence that some antibodies, that is, basically there was some immune response in bats and in people, and the immune response, whatever they were responding to, was the same. So that suggests that there may have been a virus which they shared, right? Because they both had immune response. They both seem to have reacted to that. Okay. So it's still, like I said, very preliminary, and we need to follow this up. We need to understand what is this virus? Are there many viruses? Can we find it? Like, we have only gone and worked there one time of the year when the harvest happens. Should we go and spend the whole year there, work in the cave, keep monitoring the viruses the bats are shedding? Like in the Hendra example, the shedding may be through feces of the bat or through urine or through saliva. So keep sampling the bats, looking for viruses in the bats, looking for viruses in the people. So long-term work needs to be done for us to understand this better and to really nail it. Is there spillover? When does it happen? And how does it happen? Does it happen at a specific time of the year? Does it happen with a specific virus, and so on? And why is this important? Why is it important for us to understand this? Because then we can think of, are there some behaviors which could minimize spillover? Are there certain places to avoid that could minimize spillover? So though it's very basic understanding of what's happening in terms of the bats and the viruses and the people, it will help us to think about how to manage the situation to minimize spillover. Okay. So I'm going to go now to another example from the Western Ghats, and this is a map showing you where the Western Ghats are. And this is a picture of a place we worked in there called Kadumane. Looks so beautiful, right? It actually, does it look to you like it's fragmented? Not really, it looks very nice. But when you actually map it, if you look at the map on the left-hand side, that is basically a map of Kadumane. So you can see here, you have forest, you have grassland, you have tea plantations, you have abandoned other things, cardamom, coffee, you have built up area, open, so on. So lots of little different kinds of habitat, right? And when I say, remember we talked about change, so basically all of this, apart from forest and grassland, which is natural, tea, cardamom, coffee, etc., are all change, where the landscape has been changed. We have changed it as humans. It used to be grassland and forest. We have changed it to plant tea, to plant cardamom, and so on. So the question then is, does the biodiversity in tea, just move this so I can see it better? But basically, we did a lot of work over there. And by the way, when I say we, I mean all of my students and my colleagues, collaborators. Nothing in science happens alone. There's a lot of effort from a lot of people. So I may be presenting this to you, but this is work of many, many others who are not there today to present it. But I have to acknowledge them. So here what happens is, if in the grassland are different from those which live in the forest, are different from those, some are common, but some are different, which live in these different areas. Now, what that tells you is that when the land use changed, when the forest was converted to something else, the species which live there now are different, right? So remember we were discussing about interactions. You can also imagine that in these kind of a landscape where everything is like small, small packets, there's going to be lots of interaction. And now remember, there's lots of different kinds of species. So this is again a situation ripe for spillover, where if one species which originally lived in the grassland, for example, in the satare, the red one, I think, yeah, the red one, basically, if that particular species harbors a pathogen, it's very easy now for it to spill over to other species. And for example, in the built up areas where humans live, at the bottom you can see a representation of built up area. These are, for example, the people who work in the plantation. They also have rats which live along with them in their houses and just outside their houses. Okay, so we looked at a specific pathogen here called Bartonella. One sec. Yeah, and what we looked at is in these different species like Mus musculus, Rattus satare, that's what I said was the rat, which is, specific to the Western Ghats forests. What is the presence of this specific pathogen called Bartonella? It's a bacterial pathogen. It doesn't cause mortality, but it does cause diseases. Not, we don't know about this specific Bartonella, whether it causes diseases. What we do know though is that all of these species, some of them have a much higher, almost 90% of the rats harbored this pathogen. Okay, this, but when I say this pathogen, it is genetic material for Bartonella. I'm not getting the bacteria out. I'm catching the rat, extracting the DNA or the genetic material in that blood, and then I am looking for sequences of genetic material for Bartonella. Now, not all Bartonella species are pathogenic, so I cannot say that. But they do have relatives of known pathogenic Bartonella in humans. Okay, and more than anything, almost 50% of the rodents harbor Bartonella. So now there's again a situation where you have a high chance of spillover. Now, what I've not shown you is that if I had a contiguous forest, just forest and grassland, no of rodents harboring it have gone. That's what I need to investigate. Is that true? Because if that's true, then that tells us that in these mixed landscapes, which are all fragmented with different kinds of species, the chances of these kinds of pathogens being transmitted are very high. and being at high numbers is higher. There's been other work in other parts of the world where people have shown that in these kind of changed landscapes, the number of rodents goes up. Actually, the number of species goes down, the biodiversity goes down, but the number of rodents that lives there or rats that live there goes up. And because of this, the amount of disease spilling out of those landscapes goes up. So this has been shown in other parts of the world. We don't have direct evidence for this yet in India, but this is something which we are hoping to try and understand better. Okay. So that kind of brings me to the end, and the summary is something which I'm sure I don't really need to repeat, but I hope you're convinced that there's a strong link between biodiversity and pandemics. You know, we don't think of, when you think of disease, you think of doctors, medical. You don't think about biodiversity, which seems to be natural, wild, something different, right? But these do affect each other. And today, there's a whole new concept. It's not that new, several years now, a couple of decades maybe, of an idea of something called One Health. So our health is not linked only to just me or to you. Our health as a human species is linked to the health of the domestic animals that live with us, the wildlife that lives around us, and the planet in general. It's called One Health, the environmental health as well, right? So changing biodiversity patterns are definitely linked to disease spillover. That we know for sure. I hope I've convinced you that that is the case. That it's not just that whether there is biodiversity. Uh, Biodiversity is different across the world. How much biodiversity is there? But definitely, when the biodiversity is changing, there's a high chance of spillover. And spillover of emerging and re-emerging diseases is particularly important to understand and study in India. And I hope that many of you, or some of you at least, would be really inspired to read more and to take up studies like this, because I think it's something which is very important for us to understand better. Without knowledge, we cannot go forward in countering this. And so, as a kind of a broad corollary, and I think this is something which is a big responsibility for all of you, something which my generation has actually messed up, and you guys have to deal with, is that conserving biodiversity is going to be critical, not just for water, not just for fruits and pollination and the other services we get, which we've traditionally talked a lot about, but even for human health, right? For for all of us to be healthy and happy, we must conserve biodiversity. We must understand the relationship between biodiversity and biodiversity, its loss, and human health. So I'll stop there. My daughter made this slide, so I'll show it to you. But thank you all for listening. And as I said, all of what I've talked about is based on the work is based on many students and their work, and of course a lot of funding and support from institutions and organizations. And I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Uma, for that very interesting talk. You may stop your screen share.
Yeah.
And I will be asking Pavitra, who's been monitoring the Q&A box, and also we have around 40-50 people watching from YouTube as well. So we have a few questions there. So I'll ask Pavitra to please just relay those questions to Uma, and Uma will be answering them live. Over to you, Pavi.
Hi. So, Uma, there's a few questions on why bats are such a diverse reservoir of viruses. Do they have a unique immune system? Is that why they have so many viruses that can be spread to other species?
Yeah, so I think that's what we think right now. We don't know the answer, but the first thing is it true that that bats actually harbor a lot more viruses? That is true. Bats do, compared to say rodents, right, or small mammals, rats and mice, they harbor viruses. And one thought is, one hypothesis, it's still a hypothesis, we haven't gotten enough data to prove it yet, is that they have kind of a suppressed immune system, So because bats fly, and flight is very costly, and one of the things which happens with it's very energetically costly, expensive, and one of the things which happens is that flight, continuous flight, produces reactive oxygen species, which can actually, damage DNA. These are things which can cause DNA damage and detrimental effects. But what happens is, but the thing is, it's not something which is needed, right? Because flight is expensive, but it's not detrimental to bats. And so there's some suggestions of evolution over evolutionary time, selection for kind of a dampened immune system that doesn't really react so quickly, and say create these attack these whatever these reactive oxygen species and so on. So as a result, the suggestion is that with bats, they don't overreact, right? And so they are able to harbor these pathogens without facing detrimental effects. That's an
Thanks.
idea. Sorry, before I finish. So basically, how people have tested is they've taken cell lines of bats. Basically, you can take bat cells and make cell lines, grow those cells, and they have infected them with different viruses, and they've done the same with human cell lines and other cell lines, and they found that in bats the immune response is a little is much less compared to with other species. So maybe this could be one of the reasons, because they also exist at very high densities. They also live really long. Very interesting. They live very long. Like if you take a rat, it's about the same size as a bat, but they don't live for more than 1 or 2 years. Whereas bats are known to live, 5, 10 years, really long. So for their body size, they live very long. So there's something about their metabolism and immune system which allows this.
That's really interesting to hear. And I'm going to allow a couple of questions from people live. So Abhay Bhavishi is going to ask a question now. Abhay, please ask your question.
Hi, I'd just like to say one thing. This is Maheen. To people who are asking questions in the chat window, the Q&A window, that's fine. But we really would like to encourage you to speak. So please put your hand up and ask your question to Uma directly as well. That's also an option.
Sorry, by mistake, I raised my hand. Sorry.
Oh, okay, I see. Okay, then we'll go to Harshit Mishra.
Hello, am I audible?
Yeah, hi Harshit, ask your question, please.
Good morning, everyone. First of all, thank you for this series to the organizers. I've always wanted to speak with the Ecology and Evolution Department at NCBS. So I have two questions, Uma ma'am. The first one is, you spoke about disease spilling over from animals like livestock to humans. One of the reasons is wildlife trade, and also I've read it's also due to consumption of these animals. So do we have any case where there is a spillover from, say, a prey to a predator or a predator to a prey? So that is the first question. The second question is, what are your views on the future for wildlife research? Because I am interested in that area for my masters. So those would be these are my two questions.
Can you just give me a minute? I'll be back in a minute. So yeah, that's a very interesting question about spillover from prey to predators.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I don't know of a documented case, but there are suggestions of it. But I don't know. So the thing is that it's much more likely to probably spread through vectors like ticks and things like that. And people have shown that ticks carry vectors carry these. So I think it's probably more likely to be through vectors, but it is possible. It is possible to have the spread also through consumption, but I don't know of a case that I could point to. Wildlife research, I mean, it's of course a fascinating area, and I think it's wonderful that you're interested in continuing in this area. We have a master's program in wildlife biology and conservation. In fact, we just
Yeah.
finished the interviews. And I think in terms of your question was, what is the future?
Yeah, so because today we know that now that wildlife is important and we have to prioritize it. So I am interested mostly in biogeography and phylogenetics, but this corona pandemic has started to again rethink my
Yeah.
research interest. So
Yeah.
in that sense,
Yeah. So I think, I mean, I think there's always, if you're passionate and interested, there's always scope for whatever you may want to do. And I think there's definitely a big need for us to understand, especially interactions between wildlife and humans going ahead, because there's so much more of an interface now than there was before. So I think, yeah, it's definitely something which is important, and something which is important. And if you're interested, I'm sure there's always scope for it.
okay, thank
I
you.
think that, yeah, welcome. There's some questions in the chat box, Pavitra, or you're looking at this too.
Yeah, I'm sharing those. Some of them are from YouTube. So there's another question about where are viruses actually coming from? Do they, prior to reaching the animal, where do they come from?
So, I mean, I think that's so basically we know very little about. I talked to you, for example, about the distribution of biodiversity, right? I didn't talk to you, and I talked about plants and birds and mammals. I didn't talk to you about the distribution of, say, viral diversity. I didn't talk to you about the distribution of bacterial diversity. It's because we have no clue about these things. We don't even know what's a species. We don't know. I mean, most of the work which is done on evolution of bacteria happens in the lab, and we really don't know about what happens out there in nature. So I think that that's something which we really need to learn more about. But the idea would be that you have certain viruses and certain bacteria, say, which may be infecting a specific host, and then when you have new interactions, they may jump from one to the other, and then they evolve. So because they're now in a new host and there are new selection pressures on them, and so they may change, right? Just as we know that in the SARS-CoV-2 there are now lots of mutations, new mutations. Whether those mutations have consequences for infectivity, I don't think we know, but we know there's a lot of change. So the thing is that because they have very short generation times, they can change very fast. They can evolve very fast, especially when we compare it to the human lifespan. So that's why we have drug resistant TB, drug resistant malaria, because pathogens have evolved. So pathogens can evolve and change. What are species of pathogens? We don't know how to define very well. And where they come from, we can only study by comparing them to what we know. And yet we know very little. Does that answer your question? That
I think, yeah,
Prem?
I think it does. So we'll leave a couple more questions, and Abhijit Madhusudan has raised his hand, so he can talk now.
Hello, can you hear me, ma'am?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Good morning, ma'am. My question was, are these spillovers always random, or can you predict at a particular point where the spillover can happen or not?
Yeah, so that's what I mean, that it's not random. Okay, but can you predict is a slightly different thing. Most of the time we're reacting. So for us to predict, we need to keep monitoring, right? So we need to first we have predictions, broader predictions, like, okay, in this area we expect more or that or whatever. But we need to then, for example, we would say that we could expect a spillover in the Western Ghats, in, say, in an area like Kadumane. But we need to keep monitoring, when is that going to happen. Now, whether we can predict it without monitoring, maybe we can catch it, like an early warning signal we can catch. But whether we can predict, that I don't know. That I think might be a little hard, because viruses are evolving and bacteria are evolving. So we can't predict. We know the principles of evolution, but we can't predict the exact viral sequence, this sequence will evolve to that exact sequence. We know the set of sequences it may evolve into, but we can't say exactly this will happen. So I think we will have to be, this will have to take some, a lot of effort of monitoring. We have to keep checking what's happening. But maybe we'll get to a stage where we have enough data and models that we can actually predict it, at least a probability, a high versus lower, and then we won't need so much of monitoring.
Yes. Thank you, ma'am.
Thanks, Abhijit. We have Dev Shivam Banerjee also. Please ask your question.
Hello, Professor. I have two questions for you. One question is that since we also know that the birds also fly, so is there do they also have a similar immune system as the bat? Because even there the flight would be costly. And the second question I had is that what I mean, what would be the dynamics for the viruses which we humans would give back to the wild, and how will that, and if
Yeah.
it comes back to us?
Yeah. So yeah, very good. I'm glad you raised that question. I forgot to talk about it in the end. The second question first. That yes, there are viruses which we give back. Imagine also that there are so many of us. No, there are so many humans, right? So there's likely to be so many bacteria and viruses which infect us. And for example, I don't know whether you know, but if you go to visit chimpanzees to some field work, you have to actually undergo a 2-week quarantine before you go and do field work, because you might bring new infections which the chimps may not be immune to. And basically, there are so few chimps left now. You have to quarantine yourself for 2 weeks before you actually go to observe chimps even. So there are many diseases which have spilled over maybe so basically with chimps, I think that's one of the things which we are concerned about, from humans to chimps. But there are, for example, from domesticated animals like from dogs to lions, we had the spillover of canine distemper virus, which caused almost a 30% decline. I mean, 30% of the lions in the Serengeti National Park died because of canine distemper virus. So again, there are examples where it spills over that way. Another example is the bears in India. They are no longer used for show, but there used to be bhaluwalas who had these bears, and many of those bears were infected with human TB, which they have succumbed to. So many monkeys get TB. So there are a lot of examples of human diseases going back to wildlife. They're just not probably as, and even in this case of SARS-CoV-2, there's an example of a tiger in the Bronx Zoo which contracted SARS-CoV-2. Now, it probably got it from one of the keepers. We don't know for sure. But so there is chances of spillover, reverse spillover as well, right? Uh, how much that happens depends on how host specific the pathogen is. No, like SARS-CoV-2 seems to be able to infect not every species, but several species, not maybe with the same effects as with humans, but it can infect. So I think that and there are evidences of pets getting it from their owners now, right? So I think that it is possible and something to be concerned about. What was the first question? I've forgotten now. I was talking so much about this.
Oh, the first question.
Birds. Yeah. So actually, I don't know the answer to that. I think birds basically have a very different physiology itself, um, and I don't think they are known to have these kind of immune systems as bats. As far as I understand, bats are pretty unique in this, but maybe they haven't been studied as much. They certainly don't harbor as many viruses as do bats. Bats are pretty unique in harboring a lot of viruses.
Sure. Thank you, ma'am.
Thanks, Uma. We have one last person who's raised their hand, and we'll be ending there. Mrinmay Desai, please ask your question.
Hello, can you
Hi.
hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, good afternoon, ma'am. And ma'am, thank you so much for the amazing session. Ma'am, I have one question. Recently, there was a news in the Bronx Zoo that few tigers were affected due to the corona. How likely it is going to affect another animals, like in the natural habitat or in the zoo?
Yeah, so that's something which I'm also very curious about. I don't know the answer. I don't think we should be alarmist. In fact, there's something which Saudamini and I are actually trying to explore a little bit, based on what we know, say, of the sequence data from tigers. Can we suggest that different tigers may be infected to different extents, or not? So we don't really know the answer to this, but at least based on the what we know for the sequence of the receptor to which this SARS-CoV-2 binds, monkeys have the most similar sequence to humans. So that suggests that monkeys are most likely to be infected by SARS-CoV-2 compared to other animals. And cats also have quite a similar sequence, but slightly different. Dogs is more different. And so far, from what we know, cats get infected, ferrets get infected, monkeys do get infected. Now, the progression of the disease, and maybe it's just a cold, like it just goes away, right? You don't see any B, is it going to cause respiratory stress and mortality? These are all questions we don't know the answers to. We can only speculate, but definitely, I'm really curious about like in many of our cities and towns, we have a lot of macaques, and I'm curious to know whether if the burden of the SARS-CoV-2 infection becomes very high, would they also potentially be infected and then become reservoirs for transmission? We have no ideas about any of this yet. Overall, the number of humans is so high compared to the number of macaques. It's unlikely.
Yes,
It's very unlikely, right?
yes.
But would it spread in wild areas? I really don't know the answer to that.
Thank you, ma'am.
There's a question also about a plague, and in the past it is old disease. That is true, but it has re-emerged from. So the thing is, even domestic, like sorry, what am I saying? This commensals have not been around for so long. The suggestion is commensals like rats probably cohabit with humans with agriculture, because that's when the amount of grain or amount of food available and stored became high compared to say hunter-gatherer societies. And so, yes, it is not that recent, but it's still relatively recent in human history. Whether there were outbreaks in the past, we really don't know. There's a whole field called paleo, where people look at ancient pathogens and try to understand. They can get DNA from ancient pathogens and try to understand whether they were beneficial or not. This whole area is a very big area in science. I'm sure you've heard about microbiomes and study of commensal bacteria. The number of bacteria which live with us is much more. The number of cells of bacterial cells we have is more than our number of body cells, right? We have a lot of bacteria which live along with us, but they're not all bad, right? So for us to just take a sequence or genetic material and reconstruct the function, was it a good bacteria, was it a bad one for us, is something which we still don't have enough information to do, but something which would be very interesting. So can we have precautionary measures uh, uh, to identify possibility of spread? I think that's what we need. We need to study a lot more. So, for example, based on what we know from across the world, high land use change and high biodiversity would be potential areas, right? So, if we looked at, say, the Western Ghats and we said, okay, where has the land use changed the most? Where is the biodiversity highest? Where is the people most? That will be where we need to monitor. And then we monitor there and we look at possible infections and so on. So that's what I would suggest. I know it sounds like more work, but the economic consequences of something like this are so high that we must try to understand these things better. There's also comment on food security, which is also, I think, very important. Understanding livelihoods and food security is a critical part of ensuring that. So, basically, for example, bushmeat consumption is because sometimes of lack of food security. People hunt wildlife when there is no other source of protein. So I'm not a social scientist, so I don't want to say something which is probably wrong here, but we need to understand a lot of these factors, stresses on wildlife as well, to adequately manage these situations.
Thank you so much, Uma, for answering all those questions, and thank you, Pavi, for taking us through all of them. So we're at the end of our talk right now. So I'd like to ask Saudamini, Professor Saudamini, who has been very instrumental in making this happen, and and we have a whole large number of series lined up. So for Saudamini, could you please make the closing remarks for this panel before Mahin wraps up?
Sure, and thanks Uma for this very enthralling talk. And I'm sure the audience will agree that she has shared not only her interest on tigers, but she has touched upon various stories, the bat, virus, human interactions, the biodiversity in Western Ghats, and so on. But I could also see that there was throughout a trail of you could sense the amount of kindness she has for animals. We could sense it throughout. And also she has conveyed a very important message that changes come with responsibility. And surely you got us, especially the children, the next generation, thinking about it. Thank you so much, Uma.
Thank you. Yeah. Thanks all for coming, and bye. Have a nice Sunday.
Thank you so much. I just want to ask Mahin to say a few things before we formally close our talk.
Sure.
So first of all, I want to thank Saudamini for even introducing the idea of this session to us, and the potential that this session has for outreach at the Bliss campus is phenomenal. And I think we're really looking forward to making this a reality on a very regular basis. So Saudamini, thanks. Super idea. Uma, I'm so happy that you were our first speaker. You're such an inspiration to so many of us on the campus, as well as our younger audiences. So you're fantastic as usual. I think the older people as well as younger people, I mean, this is a talk for kids, but we were all completely enraptured and just couldn't take our eyes off the screen. You're such an inspiration to us, so thank you so much. As for everybody who took time out on a Sunday morning to join us today, thank you very much. And I hope that what we've brought to you today has been inspiring and has been worth your time. And if it has, please tell your friends and bring them along to the next session, or ask them to log into the next session, because we will be doing this in a more regular fashion. I know that there are a lot of questions that we could not answer today, because of the paucity of time. Maybe we will look at extending our sessions to slightly longer, maybe 90 minutes, to take into account as many questions as we possibly can. And we are looking forward to our audience being a lot more participative and asking the questions directly and interacting with the wonderful faculty that we have. So please look out for communications on the next talk. I think the next speaker is going to be Dr. Deepa Agashi. She's another phenomenal speaker, and we're looking forward to having all of you with us next time. So thank you so much. Thank you, Uma, and thank you to our audience.